12 breakfast foods that help burn belly fat. And if you are eating the wrong ones every morning, you are silently activating the exact hormonal environment that locks belly fat in place for the next 8 hours. Not because you are lazy, not because your metabolism is broken, because of a specific molecular sequence that begins within 30 minutes of your first bite and determines whether your body spends the rest of the morning releasing stored fat or protecting it. Most people trying to lose belly fat have already cleaned up their diet. They switched from donuts to oatmeal, from bacon to egg whites, from orange juice to a green smoothie. They feel virtuous every morning, and in many cases, those choices are quietly accelerating the problem by a mechanism almost nobody in mainstream nutrition ever explains clearly. By the end of this video, you will have 12 specific foods, each with documented mechanisms and a 3-component protocol called the FAT protocol, with exact numbers for each component that determines whether breakfast works for your belly or against it. Before we get to the 12 foods, you need to understand the invisible villain running this story. The invisible villain is not fat. It is not sugar in the obvious sense. It is a hormone called insulin, but not insulin in the way the wellness industry usually describes it. Insulin is not simply a blood sugar management tool. It is the molecular lock on every fat cell in your body. As long as insulin is elevated above a specific threshold in your bloodstream, an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, the primary fat-releasing enzyme inside your adipose tissue, is actively suppressed. Not slowed down, not discouraged. Suppressed at the molecular level, meaning stored fat cannot exit your fat cells while that lock is engaged. This was documented in foundational research by Michael Rüden and colleagues at the Karolinska Institute, published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, mapping exactly how insulin inhibits lipolysis through its action on adipose triglyceride lipase and hormone-sensitive lipase simultaneously. Two fat-releasing enzymes blocked by the same hormonal signal. Here is what makes this relevant to breakfast specifically. The foods you eat in the morning, in the specific sequence you eat them, determine how long that insulin lock stays engaged after your meal. Some breakfast foods produce an insulin response that peaks sharply and clears within 90 minutes to 2 hours, reopening the fat release machinery relatively quickly. Other breakfast foods, including several that dominate the American healthy breakfast category, produce a lower but more sustained insulin elevation that keeps the fat cell lock engaged for 4 to 6 hours after you eat. You are not binging. You are eating what every nutrition article calls a balanced breakfast, and your fat cells are locked until noon. Before we walk through the 12 foods, there is one more layer you need. The belly specifically. Not subcutaneous fat, the fat just under the skin that you can pinch. Visceral fat, the fat stored inside the abdominal cavity, packed around your liver, your intestines, your pancreas. Visceral fat behaves differently from fat stored anywhere else in the body. Research from the National Institutes of Health and from Jean-Pierre Desprez at Laval University, one of the most cited researchers in visceral adiposity science, confirmed that visceral fat cells have a higher density of glucocorticoid receptors, meaning they respond more aggressively to cortisol. Visceral fat cells also have a higher rate of lipolytic activity under the right hormonal conditions. When insulin is genuinely low, visceral fat releases fatty acids faster than subcutaneous fat does. It responds to the correct metabolic signal more readily, but when insulin is elevated, visceral fat stays locked. The practical consequence is that breakfast choices matter more for belly fat specifically than for fat stored anywhere else because visceral fat is more hormonally responsive in both directions. Get the breakfast hormonal environment right, and your belly fat is among the first to mobilize. Get it wrong, and you are specifically protecting the fat you are trying to lose. This is not motivation. This is tissue-specific biology. People over 50 need this more than any other group. Insulin sensitivity declines measurably each decade after 30. Reduced insulin sensitivity means the same breakfast that produces a modest 2-hour insulin response in a 35-year-old produces a larger and longer response in a 55-year-old. The fat cell lock stays engaged longer. The fat release window between meals shrinks. And the accumulation of visceral fat that characterizes midlife weight gain is largely a consequence of this hormonal drift, not a failure of effort. Now let us start with the first 3 foods. For each one, the mechanism not just the headline. Food one is eggs, whole eggs, not egg whites. This distinction matters in a way the mainstream nutrition conversation spent decades getting backward. For years, the dietary cholesterol in egg yolks was treated as the problem, and the egg white was sold as the clean protein alternative. The problem with egg whites from a hormonal standpoint is precisely that they are protein without fat. A meal of protein without accompanying fat produces faster gastric emptying, meaning amino acids enter the bloodstream more rapidly, producing a sharper and earlier insulin response than the same protein consumed with fat present. Research from the University of Minnesota, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, examining gastric emptying rates across mixed meals, found that dietary fat is the primary macronutrient responsible for slowing gastric motility. Slower gastric emptying means slower amino acid absorption, which means a more gradual insulin response. The yolk of an egg contains approximately 5 grams of fat, including significant oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat found in olive oil. That fat slows gastric emptying and blunts the insulin response to the protein content of the white. A 2020 study published in the European Journal of Nutrition found that the presence of whole food fat sources reduced the peak insulin response to high protein breakfasts by approximately 22% compared to the same protein dose without accompanying fat. 22% is not a rounding error. Over the 4 to 6 hours following breakfast, that lower insulin peak translates to a substantially longer window during which hormone-sensitive lipase is not fully suppressed. Food 2 is full-fat Greek yogurt, not the low-fat or fat-free versions that line most American grocery store shelves. The case for full fat runs through exactly the same mechanism. Dairy fat, specifically the short-chain and medium-chain fatty acids abundant in full-fat dairy, slows gastric emptying. Research by Arne Astrup at the University of Copenhagen, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, found that full-fat dairy produced better satiety and hormonal response profiles than reduced-fat versions, without the worse cardiometabolic outcomes long assumed. Beyond the gastric emptying effect, full-fat Greek yogurt contains roughly 17 to 20 grams of protein per cup, and that protein composition includes a high proportion of casein. Casein is a slow-digesting protein that forms a gel matrix in the stomach, further slowing the rate of amino acid release. The result is an extended but low-level amino acid absorption curve. Exactly what you want at breakfast if the goal is to keep insulin modest and gradual rather than sharp and early. For people over 50, the extended amino acid availability from casein also supports muscle protein synthesis over a longer post-meal window. Muscle is the primary tissue that improves insulin sensitivity. Maintaining it is one of the most effective long-term strategies for keeping the fat cell lock open more often. Food 3 is avocado, and here the mechanism runs through a pathway almost nobody explains in morning nutrition content. Avocado is high in monounsaturated fat, primarily oleic acid. It is also high in fiber, approximately 7 grams per half avocado. The combination of fat and fiber produces a compounding effect on gastric emptying. Fat slows it through stimulation of cholecystokinin, a hormone released from the small intestine that signals the stomach to slow its contractions. Fiber slows it through physical viscosity. Soluble fiber from avocado forms a gel in the gastrointestinal tract that physically impedes the rate at which nutrients reach the absorptive surfaces of the small intestine. Two independent mechanisms pointing in the same direction. Slower absorption, more gradual insulin response, longer window of post-meal fat mobilization. Research from Loma Linda University, published in Nutrients in 2019, examined post-meal blood glucose and insulin responses in adults who consumed a standard breakfast, with and without half an avocado. The avocado group showed a 21% reduction in insulin area under the curve over the 3-hour post-meal period. 21% from half an avocado added to an existing meal. No calorie restriction, no other dietary changes, just the hormonal environment created by the fat and fiber composition of that single food. For adults over 50 with declining insulin sensitivity, a 21% reduction in post-meal insulin exposure over 3 hours means the fat cell lock is released measurably earlier after every breakfast that includes it. That is not a supplement effect, that is a food composition effect. and it is available in most grocery stores for under $2. Food 4 is wild salmon, and most nutrition coverage focuses on omega-3 fatty acids and anti-inflammatory properties. Those effects are real, but the more immediately relevant mechanism for belly fat runs through something called adiponectin. Adiponectin is a hormone produced by fat cells themselves that works in the opposite direction of insulin. Where insulin locks fat cells shut, adiponectin opens the pathway for fat oxidation at the cellular level by activating AMP-activated protein kinase. Here is the problem. Visceral fat accumulation actively suppresses adiponectin production. The more visceral fat you carry, the lower your adiponectin levels tend to be. The visceral fat itself is suppressing the hormone that would help clear it. Research by Christos Mantsoros at Harvard Medical School, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, documented that EPA and DHA, the omega-3 forms abundant in fatty fish like wild salmon, increase adiponectin secretion by roughly 14 to 16% over 8 to 12 weeks. Not a dramatic short-term spike, a sustained upward shift that gradually loosens the metabolic grip visceral fat has on its own clearing machinery. 3 ounces of wild salmon delivers approximately 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA, the range associated with meaningful adiponectin effects in the research. Farmed salmon contains omega-3s at lower concentrations and with a higher omega-6 ratio that partially offsets the benefit. Food 5 is chia seeds, and the mechanism here is one the supplement industry has tried to sell in pill form for decades. While the whole food version sits in the bulk bin for $3 a pound, chia seeds contain approximately 10 grams of fiber per 2 tablespoons, roughly 40% of which is soluble. That soluble fiber absorbs water and forms a viscous gel that physically slows gastric emptying and extends nutrient absorption across a longer intestinal surface area. One study from the University of Toronto, led by Vladimir Vuksan and published in Diabetes Care, examined the glycemic and insulin response to carbohydrate-containing meals, with and without chia seeds added. The addition of chia seeds reduced the post-meal insulin area under the curve by an average of 33%. 33%. That is the largest single-food insulin reduction in the breakfast context that appears consistently in the peer-reviewed literature. The mechanism is purely physical. 2 tablespoons added to yogurt, stirred into eggs, or mixed into water, and consumed before the rest of breakfast requires 0 cooking time and produces a measurable hormonal shift. For people over 50 whose post-meal insulin responses are already running higher due to declining insulin sensitivity, a 33% reduction is a clinically meaningful number, not a supplement claim, a physical mechanism. Food 6 is oatmeal, but in the wrong form it is working against you, and almost nobody in mainstream breakfast nutrition explains the structural reason why. The version sitting in most American kitchens is instant oatmeal, flavored packets with added sugar, or even plain instant oats, which carry a glycemic index between 65 and 83. White bread sits at roughly 75. Instant oats are barely better. Steel-cut oats have a glycemic index between 42 and 55. That gap is not a minor nutritional preference. Instant oats are pre-gelatinized during processing. The starch granules are already partially broken down before they reach your digestive system. Steel-cut oats retain the intact growth structure. Digestive enzymes have to work significantly harder and longer to break through the fibrous outer layers and access the starch inside. The result is an absorption curve that extends over 2 to 3 hours instead of 30 to 45 minutes. Research from the University of Sydney's Glycemic Index Research Service, the institution responsible for the methodology used globally for glycemic index measurement, published direct comparisons of steel-cut versus instant oat preparations. Steel-cut oats consistently produce an insulin response approximately 30 to 40% lower than instant preparations of the same caloric serving, 30 to 40%. The difference between a breakfast food that participates in fat mobilization and one that suspends it for the rest of the morning. Steel-cut oats take 20 to 30 minutes to cook. Soaked overnight in cold water, they prepare in 8 to 10 minutes. Preparation time is the only thing standing between most people and a meaningfully better insulin environment before 9 in the morning. Food 7 is almonds, and the timing matters as much as the food itself. This is where the mainstream breakfast conversation commits what I would call a quiet betrayal by omission. The standard recommendation to include nuts in a healthy diet is well supported. What almost no mainstream source specifies is that consuming almonds before the higher carbohydrate components of a meal, rather than alongside or after them, produces a substantially different hormonal outcome. Research from the University of Toronto by Cyril Kendall and colleagues, published in Metabolism, examined the insulin response when a fixed amount of almonds was consumed immediately before a carbohydrate-containing meal versus simultaneously with it versus after it. The pre-meal group showed insulin area under the curve reductions of approximately 23% compared to the post-meal group eating identical total food. The mechanism is that almond fat and fiber, approximately 14 grams of fat and 3.5 grams of fiber per 1 ounce serving, initiate cholecystokinin release and begin slowing gastric motility before the higher glycemic food even arrives in the stomach. The stomach is already primed for slower processing by the time the carbohydrate portion of the meal enters. This is a sequencing effect, not a compositional one. The same almonds in the same amount, as part of the same meal, produce 23% different insulin outcomes, depending solely on when within the meal they are consumed. 1 ounce before the toast or the oats, almost nobody doing this, because almost no mainstream source ever specifies why the sequence matters. This is the point in the video where something needs to be named directly. The foods that dominate the American breakfast category, flavored instant oatmeal, low-fat yogurt with fruit smoothies built on banana and mango, granola with dried cranberries, are genuinely better than the ultra-processed alternatives they replaced. That is not nothing. The problem is that the replacement happened inside a framework that optimized for reducing saturated fat and adding fiber, using a simplified model of metabolic health that the research had already moved past by the time those products reached grocery shelves. A low-fat blueberry yogurt contains 12 to 15 grams of added sugar to compensate for the flavor removed when the fat was stripped out. That sugar produces a faster and sharper insulin response than the fat it replaced ever did. A fruit smoothie made with 2 cups of mango, 1 banana, and skim milk delivers approximately 60 grams of rapidly absorbed carbohydrates in liquid form. No fat, no fiber matrix, no physical structure to slow absorption. These are not junk foods. They are the products of a nutrition framework that got significant things right and then froze in place while the underlying science kept moving. The people eating them every morning, believing they are doing the right thing, were handed an incomplete map. Food 8 is cottage cheese, full fat specifically. It has a property beyond the gastric emptying benefit shared with Greek yogurt. It is the highest leucine-containing whole food available in most American grocery stores at breakfast-accessible price points. 1 cup of full-fat cottage cheese contains approximately 3 grams of leucine. Leucine is the specific branched-chain amino acid that most potently activates mTOR, the cellular signaling pathway responsible for initiating muscle protein synthesis. Stuart Phillips at McMaster University has documented across multiple papers in the Journal of Physiology that leucine-stimulated mTOR activation in muscle tissue does not require insulin elevation to produce a muscle protein synthesis response when adequate leucine dose is present. This is relevant for people over 50 because muscle loss accelerates after 50, and that muscle loss worsens insulin resistance, which worsens visceral fat accumulation. Consuming a leucine-rich food at breakfast, in the context of a low insulin hormonal environment, creates a muscle-preserving signal without meaningfully extending the insulin elevation that keeps fat cells locked. The growth signal goes to muscle. The fat oxidation signal continues in adipose tissue. Not a perfect separation, but a meaningfully better outcome than the same protein consumed with rapidly digesting carbohydrates that drive insulin sharply upward before the leucine signal activates. Food 9 is green tea, consumed as a beverage alongside or immediately after breakfast. The mechanism runs through 2 compounds operating on different biological targets. The first is EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate, a catechin polyphenol that inhibits an enzyme called catechol O-methyltransferase, which breaks down norepinephrine in adipose tissue. Norepinephrine is the hormone that directly activates hormone-sensitive lipase. When catechol O-methyltransferase is inhibited by EGCG, norepinephrine stays active in fat tissue longer, and hormone-sensitive lipase activity is extended past what it would otherwise sustain. The second compound is green tea's naturally occurring caffeine, which activates the sympathetic nervous system and amplifies the norepinephrine effect through a separate pathway. A meta-analysis published in the International Journal of Obesity by Horsell and Westerter Plantenga, drawing on 11 randomized controlled trials, found that green tea catechins combined with caffeine produced a net increase in 24-hour fat oxidation of approximately 16% compared to caffeine alone. The catechins amplify the effect through an independent mechanism. 1 to 2 cups of green tea alongside breakfast, in the context of a low insulin breakfast, built from the foods in this list, extends the fat oxidation signal the breakfast hormonal environment creates. 16% more fat oxidized over a full day, compounded across weeks and months, is not a negligible number for anyone working on visceral fat reduction. Food 10 is apple cider vinegar, and the mechanism behind it is one of the most consistently misrepresented in the wellness industry. It gets sold as a fat-burning tonic, a metabolism booster, a detox agent. None of those descriptions explain why the research is worth paying attention to. The mechanism that matters is acetic acid. Apple cider vinegar contains roughly 5 to 6% acetic acid by volume. When absorbed into the bloodstream from the gut, acetic acid is converted in the liver to acetate, which activates AMP-activated protein kinase, the same cellular energy sensor that fasting and moderate exercise activate. It promotes fat oxidation and simultaneously inhibits the enzymes responsible for fat synthesis, fatty acid synthase and acetyl-CoA carboxylase, which insulin activates to build new fat when elevated. Acetic acid is hitting the opposing switch on the same machinery. Research from Tomu Kondo and colleagues at Miskan Corporation's Central Research Institute, published in Bioscience, Biotechnology, and Biochemistry, examined daily vinegar consumption in Japanese adults with obesity over 12 weeks. The group consuming 1 tablespoon daily showed a significant reduction in visceral fat area measured by CT scan. Not just body weight, but the specific abdominal depot. The group consuming 2 tablespoons showed a larger reduction. The mechanism was not caloric. Vinegar contains essentially no calories. The practical application is 1 tablespoon diluted in 8 ounces of water before the first bite. Timing matters because acetic acid also slows gastric emptying through the enteric nervous system, extending the gastric delay throughout the rest of breakfast. Food 11 is blueberries, and this requires precision because the fruit is healthy framing the mainstream uses is simultaneously true and incomplete in a way that produces exactly the wrong breakfast choices for visceral fat. Fruit contains fiber, vitamins, and polyphenols with documented metabolic benefits. It also contains fructose, and not all fruits are equal in this respect. Mango, pineapple, banana, and grapes all carry glycemic loads per standard serving that produce meaningful post-meal insulin responses. Blueberries carry one of the lowest glycemic loads per cup of any commonly available fruit. 1 cup contains approximately 21 grams of carbohydrate and 3.5 grams of fiber, producing a glycemic load of approximately 9, a low figure that generates a modest and brief insulin response. What makes blueberries specifically relevant beyond low glycemic load is their high content of anthocyanins. Research by Aidan Cassidy at the University of East Anglia, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, examined insulin sensitivity in adults with insulin resistance who consumed blueberry bioactives over 6 weeks. The high-dose group showed a 22% improvement in insulin sensitivity compared to controls. Improved insulin sensitivity means the pancreas needs to release less insulin to manage the same blood glucose level. For every meal that follows, a baseline improvement in insulin sensitivity directly translates to a lower and shorter insulin lock on your fat cells. Blueberries in full-fat Greek yogurt or alongside eggs is not a compromise between taste and biology. Both components are working in the same hormonal direction. Food 12 is ground flaxseed, and it closes the list for a reason. It has the most precisely documented effect on estrogen metabolism of any food in this category, and that connection to visceral fat is one almost nobody explains in mainstream nutrition content directed at adults over 45. Ground flaxseed contains lignans, polyphenolic compounds converted by gut bacteria into enterolignans, specifically enterodiol and enterolactone. These enterolignans are phytoestrogens that interact with estrogen receptors as weak partial agonists. They produce a mild estrogenic signal, significantly weaker than endogenous estrogen. In men and postmenopausal women, the populations where estrogen levels are lowest. This mild signal is relevant because estrogen has a documented role in determining where the body preferentially stores fat. Higher estrogen is associated with peripheral fat distribution. Lower estrogen is associated with visceral fat deposition. This is the biological basis of the waist expansion that characterizes midlife weight gain in both men and postmenopausal women. It is not simply that metabolism slows. The hormonal signals directing where new fat is stored shift toward the abdominal depot. Lignans from flaxseed partially modulate estrogen receptor signaling in a direction that may partially counteract that shift. Research from Lina Hilakivi-Clark at Georgetown University, along with supporting data from multiple clinical nutrition studies, found that regular lignan intake is associated with measurably lower visceral fat accumulation in postmenopausal women over 12 to 24-week periods. 2 tablespoons of ground flaxseed, not whole flaxseed, which passes through largely undigested, added to yogurt, eggs, or steel-cut oats delivers approximately 50 to 75 milligrams of lignans, the range used in most of the positive clinical research. For people over 50 with any hormonal shift towards central fat deposition, this is the most mechanistically targeted food on the entire list, and it costs less than $1 a week. I want to spend a moment on how I came to know most of this, because the path matters. Several years ago, I was eating what I genuinely believed was a healthy breakfast. Egg whites, low-fat yogurt, a banana, and instant oatmeal from individually portioned packets. I had cleaned up my diet, I was exercising, my doctor was pleased with my cholesterol numbers, and yet the belly fat that had appeared in my mid-40s was not moving. What changed was not willpower. It was reading the actual research on post-meal insulin dynamics and visceral fat cell biology, which nobody had ever assembled for me in a way that connected to what I was eating every morning. The egg whites without yolks generating faster amino acid absorption, the low-fat yogurt with its hidden sugar load, the banana delivering 40 grams of rapidly absorbed carbohydrates before 9 in the morning. When I understood that the problem was not my effort but a specific sequence of hormonal signals I was generating through choices the mainstream told me were correct, something shifted. The foods in this list replaced those breakfast habits over about 8 weeks. The visceral fat change became visible within 3 months, not because the foods are magic, but because they stopped creating a 4 to 6 hour insulin lock every morning and gave the fat release machinery a window to operate. Now here is the FAT protocol. 3 components, each with an exact number. F stands for fiber and fat first. The first 15 grams of your breakfast, by macronutrient contribution from fat and fiber combined, should enter the stomach before any significant carbohydrate or protein. Practically 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in water before the meal, then half an avocado or 1 ounce of almonds consumed before everything else. The 15-gram threshold is the minimum needed to initiate cholecystokinin release at sufficient levels to meaningfully slow gastric motility before the higher insulin-provoking components arrive. At 15 grams and above, the gastric emptying delay is sufficient to blunt post-meal insulin peak by 20 to 30% compared to the same meal consumed without the fat and fiber primer. A stands for anchor protein at 25 grams minimum. The breakfast meal needs to contain at least 25 grams of complete protein consumed at the meal itself. The 25-gram threshold comes from research by Donald Lehman at the University of Illinois, who identified 25 to 30 grams of leucine-containing protein per meal as the minimum required to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis in adults over 45. Below that threshold, the anabolic signal is sub-threshold and the muscle preservation benefit is left on the table. For people over 50 managing visceral fat and muscle preservation simultaneously, this number is the floor. T stands for time the eating window to end before 7 in the evening. Research by Sachidananda Panda at the Salk Institute, published in Cell Metabolism, found that ending the eating window before 7 in the evening produced consistently better metabolic outcomes, lower fasting insulin, reduced visceral fat, better insulin sensitivity markers, than identical caloric consumption in a window ending after 8 in the evening. The mechanism is circadian. Pancreatic beta cell function follows a daily rhythm that peaks in the morning and declines across the day. The same carbohydrate load at 7 in the morning produces a more efficient and shorter insulin response than at 9 in the evening, because the cellular machinery for processing it is operating at a different point in its daily cycle. Even shifting the last meal from 8:30 to 6:30 produces a measurable circadian benefit. The most common mistake that invalidates the entire FAT protocol is executing it correctly 5 days a week and abandoning the structure entirely on weekends. This is not a willpower failure, it is a biological one. Research from Till Rinneberg at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich quantified what he calls social jet lag, the circadian disruption that occurs when people shift behavioral timing by 2 or more hours on weekends compared to weekdays. 2 days of late, carbohydrate-heavy breakfast partially resets the circadian entrainment built across the prior 5 days. The minimum effective consistency is 5 days per week of on-protocol behavior, with no more than 90 minutes of meal timing variation on the remaining 2 days. Not 7 days of perfect execution, 5 days consistent, 2 days close. What is not achievable, and what most people are currently attempting, is treating the protocol as a weekday discipline and the weekend as a metabolic holiday. The weekend behavior sets the circadian baseline that the weekdays then spend 4 days recovering from. If you are going to apply the FAT protocol starting this week, comment FAT below so I can see who is actually doing this. In 2 weeks, I will follow up with data on which specific breakfast combinations from this list produce the fastest return to fat mobilization after the meal. I've been tracking this in the community and the numbers are more precise than I expected. If this is the kind of content you want, every mechanism explained, every claim sourced, subscribe. It helps this channel keep doing exactly this kind of work.